Everything has to be paid for. The United States spent approximately $4 trillion fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021. But according to Brown University's Costs of War project, the U.S. will spend an additional $2 trillion through 2050 on veterans care, interest on war debt, and ongoing operations. Victory costs $4 trillion, winning costs $6 trillion total. This episode reveals the paradox of post-war economics, why the victor often spends more rebuilding the defeated than fighting them, and how military victory becomes economic defeat. The Reconstruction Premium. World War II cost the United States approximately $4 trillion inflation-adjusted dollars. The Marshall Plan, rebuilding Europe, cost $150 billion in today's dollars over 4 years. But the Marshall Plan was just the beginning. U.S. occupation costs in Germany and Japan from 1945 to 1952, approximately $50 billion additional. Military bases, administrative personnel, reconstruction oversight, food aid, industrial rehabilitation. Total reconstruction and occupation, roughly $200 billion. This equals about 5% of what the war itself cost, a manageable ratio. The problem, this model doesn't scale to modern conflicts. Iraq War combat operations, approximately $800 billion from 2003 to 2011, according to Congressional Research Service analysis. U.S. reconstruction spending in Iraq, $60 billion through the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. But this $60 billion achieved almost nothing. The Sigir final report documented that much of the funding was lost to corruption, mismanagement, or diverted to immediate security needs rather than actual reconstruction. Meanwhile, Iraq's infrastructure remained degraded. Electricity generation in 2020 was barely above 2003 levels, despite $8 billion spent specifically on the power sector. Water systems, hospitals, schools, similar stories. The victors spent $60 billion. Iraq still needed hundreds of billions in additional reconstruction. The U.S. had no money left to provide it. The victory was military. The aftermath was economic failure. The occupation cost multiplier. Military victory ends combat costs. Occupation begins different costs. Afghanistan, U.S. combat operations cost approximately $800 billion over 20 years, but occupation and reconstruction spending totaled an additional $143 billion according to SIGAR reports. This includes training Afghan security forces, building government capacity, establishing courts and ministries, creating infrastructure. The goal: transform Afghanistan into a stable, self-sustaining state. They said reconstruction would create stability and allow withdrawal. They got a system that collapsed within weeks of withdrawal because it was entirely dependent on external funding. Afghanistan's government budget in 2020, approximately $11 billion. Domestic revenue, $2.5 billion. See, the gap, $8.5 billion, came from international donors, primarily the U.S. When the U.S. withdrew, the funding stopped. The government collapsed not because of military defeat, but because of economic impossibility. The entire state apparatus was a construction that required permanent external subsidy. The U.S. spent $143 billion building a state that couldn't survive without indefinite additional spending. The economics were never sustainable. Victory required permanent occupation, which meant permanent cost. The victor's dilemma. Here's the trap. Incomplete reconstruction creates instability. Complete reconstruction costs more than the war. Germany and Japan after WEU received massive reconstruction aid, but they had several advantages: educated populations, existing industrial bases, strong institutions before the war, and cultural cohesion. Even with these advantages, reconstruction took decades. Germany didn't achieve full economic recovery until the 1960s. Japan required extensive U.S. support through the 1950s. Iraq and Afghanistan had none of these advantages. Afghanistan's literacy rate in 2001, approximately 28%. Iraq's infrastructure had degraded through decades of sanctions and dictatorship before 2003. Transforming these into stable, prosperous states would require not billions but trillions over decades. The World Bank estimated in 2003 that full Iraqi reconstruction would cost $50–100 billion initially, with ongoing development needs far exceeding that. The U.S. spent $60 billion and left. Iraq today has a GDP per capita of approximately $5,000, compared to $26,000 in 1980 before decades of war and sanctions. The victory changed the regime. It did not restore the economy. The veterans' cost accumulation. Wars end, veterans' costs compound. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs budget in 2001, $45 billion. In 2024, $325 billion. Much of this increase comes from Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. Brown University researchers estimate the U.S. will spend approximately $2 trillion on veterans' care and disability payments for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans through 2050. This exceeds the cost of the wars themselves. Each wounded veteran requires decades of care. Traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, prosthetics, rehabilitation. These aren't one-time costs, they're lifetime commitments. Over 2.7 million U.S. service members deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. Approximately 900,000 have filed disability claims with the VA. Many claims involve long-term or permanent disabilities requiring continuous treatment. The average lifetime cost per disabled veteran, over $1 million for serious injuries requiring extensive care. For hundreds of thousands of veterans, this means the victor pays for decades after the war ends. This cost structure didn't exist in earlier wars. World War II veterans received some benefits, but medical technology couldn't save as many severely wounded soldiers. They died rather than surviving with injuries requiring lifetime care. Modern medicine saves lives. Modern budgets pay for those lives forever. The interest burden. Wars are often funded by debt. Debt requires interest payments that continue long after fighting stops. The U.S. borrowed approximately $2 trillion to fund Iraq and Afghanistan wars. At average interest rates of 3 to 4%, that's $60–80 billion annually in interest payments. Over 30 years, $1.8 to $2.4 trillion in interest. Just interest, not the original principal. The Costs of War Project calculates that by 2050, the U.S. will have paid more in interest on war debt than it spent fighting the wars. The victory costs $2 trillion in combat. The interest on victory costs more than the victory. This pattern repeats historically. The United Kingdom finished paying off its World War I debts in 2015, nearly 100 years after the war ended. The interest accumulated over decades exceeded the original borrowing. Victors celebrate when fighting stops. Treasuries pay for decades afterward. The Reconstruction as trap. Sometimes Reconstruction becomes a trap rather than a cost, an endless requirement to spend because the alternative is worse. The U.S. occupied Germany and Japan for years, but eventually withdrew. Why? Because Reconstruction succeeded. Both nations developed self-sustaining economies and stable governments that no longer required occupation. Iraq and Afghanistan didn't achieve this. Withdrawal meant collapse, but continuing meant indefinite spending. Afghanistan presented the pure form of this trap. Each year of occupation cost approximately $45 billion, $35 billion for military operations, $10 billion for reconstruction and aid. Staying cost $45 billion annually. Leaving meant the entire previous investment would collapse. By 2020, the U.S. had spent nearly $2 trillion over 19 years. Leaving meant that investment would produce no lasting result, but staying meant spending another $45 billion per year forever. The rational calculation: accept the loss and leave. The political calculation, stay longer hoping for success. The economic reality, throwing good money after bad. The U.S. left in 2021. The Afghan government collapsed. The $143 billion in reconstruction spending produced essentially nothing lasting. This is the victor's trap. Reconstruction costs compound, but incomplete reconstruction leaves nothing. You either spend enough to succeed, which may be impossible, or you spend until you give up and accept total loss. The comparative framework. The Marshall Plan is remembered as a success. It cost $150 billion and created prosperous allies. But the conditions were unique. Europe in 1945 had been the wealthiest region globally before the war. It had educated populations, industrial experience, scientific capacity, legal systems, property rights. The Marshall Plan restored what existed before, not created what never existed. Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001-2003 were among the poorest nations globally. They lacked most institutional infrastructure. Reconstruction wasn't restoration, it was attempted creation of entirely new systems. The Marshall Plan worked because it rebuilt. Iraq and Afghanistan reconstruction failed because it attempted to build from scratch. The cost difference: rebuilding takes 5% of war cost. Building from scratch might take 300% of war cost. The alternative calculation. What if the U.S. had spent $2 trillion on domestic infrastructure instead of Afghan reconstruction? $2 trillion funds approximately 40,000 schools, 2,000 hospitals, complete modernization of U.S. electrical grid, universal pre-K for a generation, high-speed rail networks across major corridors. The opportunity cost of failed reconstruction, everything that could have been built at home. The British Empire understood this by the early 20th century. Colonial wars became too expensive not because of combat costs but because of administration and development costs afterward. Victory required permanent occupation. Permanent occupation required permanent expense. The empire became a cost rather than a benefit. The U.S. learned this lesson in Iraq and Afghanistan but paid $2 trillion in tuition. The generational payment plan. Wars concentrate costs in time. Post-war obligations spread them across generations. Vietnam War veterans still receive VA benefits 50 years after the war ended. World War II veterans received benefits until the last survivors died in the 2020s, 75+ years after victory. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans will require care until approximately 2070-2080. The war ended in 2021. The costs continue for 50 to 60 more years. Future taxpayers will pay for wars they weren't alive to see. This is the generational burden transfer. The victor's generation makes the decision to fight. All subsequent generations pay for the aftermath. The calculation: Iraq and Afghanistan wars cost $4 trillion from 2001-2021. Post-war costs from 2022-2050 will add another $2 trillion. Total cost, $6 trillion. If spread across the U.S. population of 330 million people, $18,000 per person, including people not yet born who will pay taxes to fund veterans' care and debt interest. The bankruptcy of victory. Some wars bankrupt the victor even in victory. Britain won World War I but emerged economically devastated. The war cost $35 billion, roughly 5 times the pre-war GDP. Britain spent the next 30 years managing war debt while its empire began disintegrating because it could no longer afford imperial defense. They won militarily, they lost economically. The victory accelerated decline. The Soviet Union won World War II, but at catastrophic cost. Estimates suggest 27 million deaths and 25% of physical capital destroyed. The USSR never fully recovered economically, and many historians argue the war's costs contributed to eventual Soviet collapse. Victory doesn't guarantee prosperity. Sometimes victory just means you're the last one standing but still wounded. The systemic revelation. The pattern reveals a system principle: wars have endings, obligations do not. Combat ends when one side surrenders or withdraws. But Reconstruction obligations, veterans care, debt payments, occupation costs, these continue as long as systems designed around them exist. The U.S. military has bases in Germany, Japan, and South Korea 70-plus years after the wars that put them there. These aren't war costs, they're post-war costs that became permanent. Each base costs approximately $200 million annually to maintain. Over 70 years, even a single base costs $14 billion. See, the U.S. maintains hundreds of overseas bases. These exist because of wars that ended decades ago. The wars ended, the costs didn't. Everything has to be paid for, and victory's prize isn't paid in a signing ceremony or a parade down the Capitol. It's paid in decades of veterans care, in generations of debt service, in reconstruction costs that dwarf combat spending, and in the realization that winning the war was the cheapest part. Subscribe to The Price of Conflict to understand how military victory becomes economic defeat.